Welcome everyone tonight. We're a small group, but I promise we'll still learn a lot. I thought it might be helpful to start, just because we're a small group, with some introductions so we all kind of know who each other are. And I don't know whether you know each other, but just in case not, and of course I'm new here, so why don't I start and tell you a little bit about myself, and then maybe we can go around and learn a little bit about everyone else. So I guess you know my name. I'm David Campbell, and I teach at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. My university is famous in America for football, the American version of football, although I don't claim to have any expertise in that. Even though I'm an expert in American politics, I'm actually not an American citizen. I am from Canada, but I was educated in the United States. Both my undergraduate degree and my doctorate come from American universities. My undergraduate degree is from Brigham Young University, and my doctorate is from Harvard University. And among the many things that I've studied is the topic that we'll discuss tonight, social capital. And I'll explain what that is and why it's important, and hopefully give you a sense of how social scientists like myself understand social capital. Do you want to try to translate some of that?
No, is it necessary to translate? No.
No? Okay, good. Well, in that case, would it be all right if we went around and did some introductions? Now, I learned a little bit about you, but why don't we start over here?
I'm Konstantin Kokyrev. I'm a lecturer at Russian Presidential Academy. I'm interested in educational technologies, critical thinking, and judicial policy from the point of political science.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Good.
Okay. Hi, my name is Anna, and the sphere of my interests is history, but particularly ancient one, and also I sometimes work with some kind of sources and modern ones as well, and the other aspect which I'm very interested in is political propaganda. So that's all about me.
Hi, my name is Jane Yevgenia. I'm PhD in history, and I hope that I'm interested in Russian history, medieval history, 17th century, yes, and the beginning of Romanovs, yes, the father of Peter the Great. So I wrote about him. I'm going to continue my research. So that's my interest.
So you have a PhD?
Yeah.
I think we all have.
No,
No?
You're still working on it. He's still working on it.
Most of us.
I resist.
Hi, my name is Natalia. I'm Vice Dean Liberal Arts College, and I'm a lecturer of sociology and great books.
Uh-huh. No,
Thank you.
Great books, yeah, I get that.
My name is Galina Klimova. I'm also a historian, but sphere of my interest is contemporary history, honestly speaking, European Union, the problems of identity, social policy, and so on.
All right. Well, why don't we begin with a question? I have a question for you. Have any of you ever heard of the term social capital? Is that something you've ever run across before? Just so I have a sense of where people are. You have? You have as well? But you two have not. Okay. Would you mind telling me what you know? Is it just a term you've heard, or is it something that you might be able to explain? Again, this is all just to help me sort of figure out where to start.
Maybe it's hard to define at the end of the day, but social capital, if I'm not mistaken, at the end of the day, it consists of two basic parts. The number of relations that you have, that you can work with your friends, your colleagues, and so on. not the weak ties, but the strong ties.
Yeah, that's very good.
No, and I remember that there is the second part, but it's out of my mind now. Sorry, really.
Well, we'll talk some about that tonight, strong ties and weak ties and what that all means. And even though I'm a political scientist, I actually suspect that what I'll discuss tonight about social capital actually does apply to the study of history. It's true that most research on social capital has been done by scholars of political science like myself, or sociologists or economists, but the ideas, the principles actually apply to the study of history as well. In fact, one of the most famous books on social capital, which was actually about Italy, goes way back in history to try to understand Italy's democratic performance today by understanding what went on centuries in the past. Now, I'm no expert on Italy, but I'll talk a little bit about that book nonetheless. So my hope tonight is to provide an introduction to the concept of social capital. And then I'm actually going to focus on a major source of social capital. And don't worry, I'll define it in a moment. But I'll focus on a major source of it in the United States, but I believe this would apply everywhere. And that is through religious congregations. And if, I don't know, were any of you at my lecture last night? It's okay if you weren't. So last night I talked about the role of religion in American society, and so I thought it might be useful if I pick up on that theme and talk a little bit more about that again tonight. But I'll get to that in a few minutes. I actually want to start with another question. And this is actually a harder question than you might think to answer. So let me ask you, why does anyone turn out to vote in an election? So we'll put aside those countries that require people to vote. So Belgium does that and Australia does that. So we'll put aside countries where you have mandatory voting. But in other systems, like Russia, like the United States, like most other nations, why do you think people vote?
I suppose that probably it's some kind of dream that they have at least any possibility to influence their living conditions. I'm not sure that most part of people are interested in politics, but first of all, and I think the second point is propaganda.
Propaganda?
Yeah.
Now, okay, just before we get to your answer, let's go back to your choice of words was interesting. You said that for some people it might be a dream.
I'm speaking in case of history and in case of political situation in post-Soviet countries. So there is the idea of democracy, but as far as we see that political elite doesn't change greatly, so we see that so it's mostly not really working in general. So we have the principle, but unfortunately it doesn't work well.
Okay.
I have another idea. I think that in many cases, maybe and I feel that in Russia, maybe in most cases, for some people of some age, voting is some kind of conforming behavior. They behave themselves as conformists. It's not propaganda, but they used to go and vote.
Yeah.
And that's why they are voting. Maybe pensioners and so on. Not only them.
Right, but so it's a habit.
Yeah, it's a habit, and in many for many persons who work at some kind of conditions, maybe for the government and something like this, they are forced to.
They're forced to. Well, okay,
Maybe
yes.
they-
So
not maybe actually, but they think that
They think
many
they
think
are.
that
All
they are
right.
forced to.
So I want to put aside the idea that anyone, for the purposes of our discussion, there are certainly places and circumstances where people might be forced to vote. But we want to put that aside. Okay, so we want to talk about why people vote when it's a choice to vote or not. The reason that I ask that question is, believe it or not, among political scientists, that is a tough question to answer. I'm sorry. I blew right past that. Go ahead.
Мне кажется, что это некоторый фрейм для тех обществ, которые ну, как-то обустраивают свою привычность жизни. И есть у меня такое впечатление, что мы сейчас говорим сразу обо всем, но нужно, наверное, выделять некоторые исторические ситуации, одни из которых являются некоторой такой стабильностью, а другие в острой стадии перехода от одного типа общества к другому. И здесь разные модели, видимо, там реакции на голосование, потому что в первом случае это вот то, о чем я говорила, это некоторый фрейм привычности, а во втором случае это то, о чем говорила Галина, видимо, связано с, ну, там, с мечтой, с такой мобилизационной идеологической.
Okay.
Да, и я бы все-таки, наверное, настаивала на словосочетании мобилизационная идеология, потому что когда это и не пропаганда, это и не фрейм, а что-то такое вот. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate all of your answers, and you can see there are different responses to that question of why people turn out to vote. And that goes back to the point I was making earlier, that this is actually a difficult question to answer of why any one individual bothers to vote in an election. And the reason for that is if you think about what happens in an election, the odds or the probability that any one person will affect the outcome of the election is basically zero. In other words, even in a very close election, the chances that your vote will make the difference basically impossible. And so when you think about voting that way, if you are, say, an economist or someone who thinks about people as being rational actors, no one should ever vote. Because if you vote in order to affect the results of the election, that's sort of what you were saying about the dream you have of bringing about change, if that's why people turn out to vote, no one should ever vote. Does that make sense when I say it that way? Okay. Now, there's actually a lot of math that goes along with that, but that's the basic idea. Now, let me just underscore that what I've just said about voting and the difficulty of understanding why anybody might vote is actually true for many, many activities that all of us engage in on a regular basis. So let me give you another example. Why does anyone give money to a charity? It's the same principle that if you make a donation to a charity, particularly a large charity, whatever money you give, it'll make a small but a very, very small difference to that charity. And so if everyone acted rationally, no one would ever donate to a charity, especially donating to a charity that provides a public good, a good that is available to everyone. Another example might be asking the question of why anybody would donate blood to a blood bank. This is perhaps the best example I could give of this sort of problem, and there's a name for what I'm describing. I'll get to that in a moment. But if you think about the way a blood bank works, whether or not you've donated blood, if you're injured and you go to a hospital, you will be given the blood. Right? If you need blood, you will get blood. Nobody asks you whether or not you've donated blood before. And so again, if you think about that, why would anybody give blood? Giving blood might cause a little bit of pain. It certainly takes some time. It's not an easy thing for people to do. And yet, nonetheless, people do it. Okay? So think about those three things. Voting, giving money to a charity, donating blood. In all three cases, if people were strictly rational actors, if all they thought about were costs and benefits, what was good for themselves and no one else, you would not expect anyone to do any of those three things. In fact, there's a whole long list of things that we would not expect people to do if they acted in a completely rational way. In each one of those cases, the problem that we have in trying to explain why people behave the way they do is known as, can I write on the board? The collective action problem. Is that a term that anybody's run across before? You have, because you're a political scientist. You know all about this. What we mean by the collective action problem is that when we have collective goods, public goods, like donating blood, giving money to a charity, or voting in an election, you would not expect any individual to actually engage in that activity. So they, as I said, they shouldn't give blood and they shouldn't vote, and yet they do. Well, it's all fine and dandy to have a theory that says that people should not engage in collective action because whether or not they do that thing, they're going to get the benefit anyway. So whether you donate the blood or not, you're still going to receive blood if you need it. There are lots of ways that, even though that's a theory that says it shouldn't happen, that we've now come to understand why people do these things, right? So obviously people do vote, obviously people do give money to charities, and obviously people do give blood. But again, trying to understand why is a little tricky, because if we just thought about people as being rational actors, calculating costs and benefits, no one should do any of those things. There are a variety of explanations for how it is that the collective action problem is overcome. But tonight, I'm going to focus on one particularly powerful explanation, and that's the concept of social capital. Now, as I talk about social capital, the one thing you want to keep in mind is that that term has come to mean many different things to many different people. So what I'm hopefully going to do tonight is give a definition and then understand how it's measured and then understand how it's used. But I want to warn you that if you go and read about social capital by other scholars, you might not always find that the way I've used it here tonight is the way other scholars do. Now I'm going to tell you the way I do it is right and they're wrong. No, I'm just kidding. But just be aware that this term can be used in different ways by different people. That term, social capital, has actually been used by a lot of different scholars over a long stretch of time. But I want to start with one scholar in particular who I think is sort of the modern father of social capital. I'm going to talk a little bit about him, and then I'll talk about someone who followed the originator, who I think has actually become even more famous because of the concept. The first person I want to talk about is a sociologist named James Coleman. He taught at the University of Chicago for many years. He was a very prominent sociologist. He wrote a book entitled Foundations of Social Theory. This is a massive book. It's about this thick. It's a massive book. Because he was trying to get to this fundamental explanation of why it is that people do the things they do, and specifically why people behave socially the way they do. And his great intellectual project was to try to unite sociology and economics together. So he was interested in questions like why people turn out to vote. He was interested in questions like why students do better in some schools rather than in other schools. He was even interested, this book even covers how markets work. Specifically, believe it or not, the diamond market in New York City is one of the things that he studies. This is a massive book. It covers a lot of different types of human behavior. But at the core of it all, James Coleman was interested in the concept of social norms. By norm, he meant the expectations for how people believe they ought to behave. Does that make sense? So a norm is how you believe you ought to behave. And it's important to stress that a norm is different than a law, because a law is what the state tells you you have to do. A norm is not written into any kind of code or statute, and there's no formal enforcement of it. You know, laws are enforced by the police and by the courts. Norms are not, and yet nonetheless people follow norms. A lot of the behavior that we engage in involves our following norms. The way we're dressed tonight, that's an example of a norm. The fact that we kind of all know what to do and we sit down and have a discussion, that's another example of a norm. These are things we do all the time so we don't think about them, but they're actually really important for understanding human behavior. They're almost like the code or the script that we follow when we behave. So Coleman writes his book, and the concept of social capital was especially important for him in explaining how students perform in school. And in order to make sense out of that, I need to go back a little bit into American history. In the United States, we have two different types of schools. And this is probably true in most countries. We have public schools. These are the schools paid for by the taxpayers. And that's where most students go to school. When I say school, I mean up through, let's say, 12th grade. Okay. And so most American students attend public schools. But about 10% of American students attend a private school. It's a school where they have to pay tuition, and it's not run by the state. And in the United States, a private school is truly private, receives no money from the government. In some other countries, there might be private schools that still get funding from the state. But in the United States, at least at the time when James Coleman was doing his research, private schools did not receive any money from the state, no tax dollars. And many of those schools are religious. Not all of them, but many of them are. And specifically, many of them are Catholic schools. They're run by the Catholic Church. Now, at the time that James Coleman was working on the question of why students perform better in some schools than others, there was a widespread belief that turned out to be wrong in the United States, that students in public schools did better than students in private schools. Now, that might seem a little mysterious to you because sometimes we think of private schools as being for the elite, right? These are the schools that are very expensive. And it is true that, at least in the United States, there are a small number of private schools that are very expensive, and they probably do a better job with their students, although it's hard to tell because the students are already quite wealthy and advantaged when they go to those schools. But most private schools, because they're religious, they actually had the reputation of not being particularly good schools. And the reason that they had that reputation is that their buildings were often old, their teachers were not paid very well, they didn't have very large libraries, they typically didn't have gymnasiums, their textbooks were often old, etc., etc. So if you just sort of looked at private schools, most of them, and compared them to the public schools, it looked like the public schools should do better because the public schools were bigger, they generally had newer buildings, they generally had gymnasiums, and they had libraries, and they just seemed to have all the stuff that makes for a good school. But Coleman was interested in explaining, again, why students do better in one kind of school versus another. And so he was the head of a major research project that came up with what was a very surprising and even controversial finding at the time. So this is back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And what he found is that students in those private schools, or specifically those religious schools, actually performed better than students in public schools. And in particular, he found that minority students, African American students in particular, seemed to do better in those small private schools that were, one term we might use in the US is under-resourced. They didn't have all the stuff that you find in the public schools. And this was a puzzle. How could this possibly be? How could it possibly be that these schools that didn't appear to have and I'm going to introduce the word capital here, financial capital, how could they possibly have their students perform better than the students in public schools? Well, Coleman is interested in that puzzle. It's a classic kind of puzzle that social scientists like to be able to answer. And so he did a lot of research and concluded that the answer lie in the social networks, the relationships that those students had, not only with one another, but with their parents, and that the parents all had with one another, and that the teachers had with the parents, and that the teachers had with other members of the communities. Because it turns out that those schools, they were embedded in these very tight-knit communities. And in those communities, there was a very strong norm that encouraged students to stay in school and to study hard. And if they skipped out of school, there was somebody in the neighborhood who knew who they were and would call their parents and say, hey, I saw your little boy wasn't in school today. And they would make sure that he would attend school. And so Coleman wanted to try to capture that whole idea that these schools that everybody thought were not doing very well, they were doing well. He wanted to capture that idea of those social relationships. And so he came up with the term social capital to explain the difference between one type of school and another. That those private schools, that they had strong social capital. And what he meant by social capital was social networks that are formed among people, and the fact that when people develop those networks, they have those personal relationships that you were mentioning earlier, strong norms of behavior then follow. In fact, all right, can you see that? Okay, so the definition that I'm going to use for social capital tonight comes out of the work initially of James Coleman, but then he was followed by Robert Putnam, and I'll talk about him in a moment. But the definition is that we have these social networks and the norms of reciprocity and trustworthiness that arise from those networks. Now, what do I mean by reciprocity? The idea of a reciprocal relationship or reciprocity is that if I do something for you, you do something for me. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. But the idea of social capital is that people not only have a specialized or a specific form of reciprocity in mind. I do something for Galena. I loan her some money, and then she, knowing that she would loan it back to me. The idea is that if people are in a tight social network where people come to trust one another, they developed what is known as a generalized sense of reciprocity, that I will help those who are in need, not because I expect that specific person to help me, but because I'm basically making a deposit in this social bank, and I know, or at least I assume, that in the future, if I were in need, somebody else in that network would come to help me. It might not be the same person I helped, but it would still be somebody within that group. So I help Galena, and the reciprocity might not be that she in turn helps me, but rather that she ends up helping someone else, or that someone else in that network steps in order to help. So that's the idea of these norms of reciprocity arising from these social networks, and it all rests on trust. So Galena does something for me, and I do something for her, or she does something for me, and then somebody else does something for her, because we all come to trust one another. And why do we trust one another? Well, it's because we have a social network. And it's funny that we use that term, because I don't actually mean a social network in the sense of Facebook, or, this comes long before we had anything like that. And it is interesting that we talk a lot about social networks today in a very different way. But this sort of social network is a face-to-face relationship that people have with one another that is ongoing. And that was what was going on in those communities where those schools were located. And remember, I mentioned that Coleman studied all sorts of other things in his book. It's also what was going on in these diamond markets in New York City, where he found diamond merchants who, quite amazingly, would interact with one another with very expensive jewels that they would just hand to somebody else. And then that other person would take those jewels and appraise them and bring them back. And it was all based on trust. They weren't signing any contracts and they didn't have any armed guards. They were just exchanging these jewels with one another in order to make the market work. It was an amazing thing. And how were they able to do that? Well, it's because they all came to trust one another. And it turns out in that case, those people also shared an identity. They were all Orthodox Jews. And so because they were part of this tight-knit community, there was a very strong sense of reciprocity. You help me, I help you. Well, I help you, you help somebody else, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So that was, again, is what is going on within those social networks. Now, that might all seem kind of abstract. Why should you care about a bunch of schools in the United States or about the way diamonds are sold in a particular city? That all seems kind of weird. But Coleman was able to piece this all together and try to come up with this, what we might call a meta or a large explanation for what's going on with human behavior that rests on the idea that when people interact with one another in these social networks, all sorts of interesting things happen. Although the way he wrote it, all sorts of good things happen. And I want you to remember that. We're going to come back to that idea because initially, social capital was always thought to be a good thing. Okay? You're with me? All right. That brings us to scholar number 2, who perhaps is a little better known than James Coleman. Coleman's somewhat famous, but the second name that I want to introduce to you is actually my dissertation advisor when I was in graduate school, and also a co-author of mine in a book that we published a few years ago. And his name is Robert Putnam. Robert Putnam published a book now about 20 years ago about Italy. The book was titled Making Democracy Work. It's an interesting book, even if you don't care about Italy, because it has some pretty profound things to say about the way governments work. What Bob Putnam was able to do was study the creation of new governments in Italy. So if you know your Italian history, you know that it was in the early 1970s, so think about 40 years ago, that Italy created a series of state governments, regional governments. Prior to that, everything had been centralized. And so they were becoming a federal state. Of course, there are many federal states around the world. That leads to an interesting question. Why, in a federal state where you have different state governments, why do some of those governments work better than others? Why are some governments more efficient? Why are they more responsive to their constituents, their voters? But most of the time, in fact, basically for every other country, if you want to try to study government performance, you're stuck with a problem, which is that you're coming into the study after those governments have long been established. They've been operating for a long time. But in Italy, Putnam and his collaborators, they were there, beginning their research when those governments were formed, which meant that they could trace what happens in those states from the very beginning, from the very creation of those governments, and they followed them for 20 years to try to figure out why governments work better in some places versus others. And their original hypothesis is one that is probably pretty intuitive. Their original hypothesis was governments work better where the economy is stronger. Does that make sense? So you have strong economic performance, you have better democratic performance. And at the time, maybe even today, that was known as modernization theory. The idea being that if you're economically developed, you are a modern state, and modern states would have better governments. And so that was his initial hypothesis, he and his collaborators. But he found, upon researching what was going on in these regional governments in Italy, that it didn't seem to be economic performance that predicted how well those governments performed. There were some cases, certainly, of Italian states or regions where the economy was strong and the government seemed to work well. Okay. But then there were some states where that wasn't the case. The economy worked well and didn't seem to be necessarily the case that, that the government worked well. And more telling, there were cases where we had a weak government. So we had a poor government and strong economy, or we'd have a strong government and a poor economy. So we had some sort of contrary examples. So it wasn't simply the case that all the good governments were in places where the economy was strong and all the bad governments were in places where the economy was weak. So that led Putnam to begin to think, well, what else might explain the performance of government? If it's not the economy, what else might it be? And he came upon another explanation. And the explanation turned out to be that in those parts of Italy where people were more likely to form clubs and join groups, and when I say clubs and groups, I don't mean political groups. I mean things like, the book is sort of famous for pointing out chorale societies, choirs. I don't know if that translates well, but people join choirs, or they join sports clubs, or all sorts of other groups and such. And believe it or not, those parts of Italy where people were more likely to join those sorts of organizations, and apparently this varies a lot across the country, it was in those places that you were more likely to find a strong government. And by strong government, I mean I don't necessarily mean it's not an authoritarian type government, but a government that works well, where they're able to balance their budget, for example. They're able to respond to voters' concerns. And they ran all sorts of little studies that were kind of interesting. And they would call up a government bureaucracy, and they would pretend that they would have a problem. And they would test how the bureaucrats would respond to their problem in the various states of Italy. And that was one of their measures of how government was performing. They had all sorts of measures. That's the bottom line. But he has this finding that it's in places where people belong to these groups, these clubs, that seem to predict better government. And so this was another puzzle. How could that be? Why wasn't it the economy that's explaining the performance of government? And so in his research, Putnam borrows from Coleman. He actually discovers the work of Coleman. And remember, Coleman wasn't studying governments. He was studying all this other stuff, right? He was studying how diamond markets work, and he was studying how schools work. But Putnam has this insight in which he says, wait a second, maybe what is going on in those Italian states is that when people belong to those groups and associations, they're forming social capital. They are having those social networks and developing that norm of reciprocity. The idea that I will help someone. I'm going to help Galena, not because I necessarily expect Galena to come back and help me, but because I expect somebody else in our network, our community, to help. And how do people form those networks? How do they form those communities? Well, they do so by joining together in all these clubs and groups and such. So it's not necessarily, according to Putnam, only clubs and groups that bring people together. But that happens to be a very, very powerful way of understanding social networks. This is another sort of fundamental way that social scientists work. It's a good proxy. If you want to understand where you have a lot of social capital, you want to look and see where people are forming groups. It's not the only way that people form social capital, but it happens to be a pretty powerful predictor of it. So that's what he finds in Italy. And you might say, well, that's Italy, that's an interesting study. But when he published the book, he made a slightly larger claim in which he said that it's not just Italian governments that can be explained by social capital. That maybe this is how all democratic governments can be explained. In other words, maybe if we want to understand what makes democracy work, remember that was the title of the book, Making Democracy Work, is we need to look not just at the institutions of government and how they're set up and how constitutions are written and all that kind of stuff, but we also need to look at social capital and whether or not people are forming those networks with one another. And by forming those networks, they're developing that norm of reciprocity. When they form that norm of reciprocity and they come to trust one another, it means the government performs better. Why? Well, one reason is that the people who get elected to government, they are part of that community. And so they believe that they should act in such a way that they are going to benefit the whole community. And it also turns out that this idea of social capital, originating with Coleman and then further developed by Putnam, also helps us explain the collective action problem. Because it's in places where you have these strong networks and norms that people behave in a way that does not only benefit themselves. Remember, the core of the collective action problem is that if people only thought about themselves, they would never vote. They would never give money to charity. They would never give blood. And again, there's a whole variety of other things that you could come up with. They would never pick up litter. They wouldn't behave in a way that would help the community. They would only behave in a way to help themselves. But if you're in a community with a lot of social capital, then people begin to think not just of themselves, but also of the community. And that, in turn, helps us understand why governments perform better, because the government, the people in the government, are also concerned about their own community, not just themselves.
I'm just thinking how to correlate the notion of social capital and the civil society.
Mm-hmm. Well,
No, I'm just...
yeah, I would actually say that the term civil society has a lot of overlap with social capital. So when we describe social capital, I actually do often use the term civil society. But what I want to stress is that civil society is not the only way that we could measure social capital. That so we look at civil society, which we can think of as all of those parts of society that are not the state and not the market. Everything else falls into civil society. It is in that realm, in that civil society, that social capital is being built. And so we often think of civil society as consisting of the clubs and groups and associations and organizations that people belong to. And all of that is extremely important for understanding social capital. But social capital can also be built outside of organizations. That just people getting together and interacting with one another, that also consists of social capital. That makes sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. And the reason I want to make that point actually helps us understand sort of the next step in the evolution of the concept of social capital. Okay, so we started with Coleman, then it goes to Putnam. Putnam studying Italy, but then after he publishes the book on Italy, he writes an article. It's actually a very, very short article, but it's become extremely famous. In the article, he focuses on the United States. So he takes his ideas from Italy, he transports them to the United States. He's an American, he teaches at Harvard at an American university. It would make sense that he would sort of try to understand what's going on with social capital in America. And so in 1995, he publishes an article in which he argues social capital in America is declining. And his main reason to believe that there is a decline in social capital is that Americans were less and less likely, and he has trends of this over time, to belong to groups and associations and organizations of the sort that he was studying in Italy. And he came up with a famous metaphor to explain that decline. The metaphor actually rests on the game of bowling. And I have to admit, I should have asked this before we started. Do people bowl in Russia? Do you know what I mean when I say bowl? Yeah, you bowl? Okay. Okay, well, one of the declines, one of the things that Putnam finds was dropping in America was bowling in leagues. there was once a time when it was very common for people to belong to a bowling team. A lot of Americans did this. Right? They would belong to a team, and their team would compete in a league, and so every Tuesday night they'd get together and they'd bowl. And Putnam is plotting the decline of many other clubs and groups and associations, but in particular he focuses on bowling leagues. Not because bowling leagues are themselves special, but because they perhaps represent a changing nature of America. So there's this change, and it also enabled him to use this metaphor that's become famous, in that he describes Americans as bowling alone. So they're not bowling in leagues anymore. Now they're bowling alone. And that's what he titled the article, Bowling Alone. Everybody remembers that title. But in addition to the decline in bowling leagues and the decline in all these other clubs and associations, he also finds that Americans are less trusting of one another. And remember that trust is a really important part of social capital. Right? And so Putnam says, look, something is wrong in American society. We're having this decline in what appears to be our different measures of social capital. And a huge debate breaks out. So this is about 20 years ago. It's a huge debate over whether or not Putnam is right. I was in graduate school. I was working with him at the time. And I can tell you this was a huge issue, big controversy. Because some people said Putnam is wrong. Social capital is not declining because what he's done is just measure all of these old-fashioned types of organizations. I mean, bowling. Nobody does bowling anymore, but now they belong to what in America you'd call a soccer league, and the rest of the world they'd call it a football league, right? Or people belong to book groups. Book groups weren't a thing back in the 50s. Well, they're a thing now. What about book groups? And what about all these other various ways that people might get together? And the internet was just becoming common at the time. And so there was also a lot of speculation that, well, sure, people aren't getting together and bowling, and they aren't belonging to clubs and groups, but they're now interacting with one another on the internet. And so really, we don't need to worry about social capital. Then there was another group of people who said that the whole idea of social capital wasn't worth studying anyway. And so again, huge debate over this stuff. Well, 5 years later, Putnam publishes a book also titled Bowling Alone. And in the book, he details not just bowling leagues and not just a few of the trends that he did in the original article, but chapter after chapter shows that social capital was in decline. And I would say that with the publication of that book, the debate over whether or not there really has been a decline in social capital, that debate is pretty well over. Meanwhile, after the publication of that book, the literature on social capital kept growing. So I focused on these two names of Coleman and Putnam, but they are only two of many, many other scholars across many different disciplines who've become very interested in this idea of social capital, that when people come together and they form these networks, and in these networks they come to trust one another, all sorts of positive things happen. So some examples would be those who study criminology have found that in communities where there's a higher level of social capital, you have a lower level of crime. It also turns out that in communities where you have higher levels of social capital, people are healthier. And keeping with Coleman's original research, in places where you have higher levels of social capital, you have better schools. Students perform better. Now let me just pause here and ask, does anyone have a possible explanation of why social capital, for example, might lead to lower crime? So think of how I've described social capital. Why do you think in communities with high social capital, we have low crime?
There's the idea of community policing, when you don't need an officer to control.
Yes, you don't need an officer. Why don't you need an officer? You don't need a police officer.
Yeah,
Why?
Because you have your neighbors. They are watching. And you have standards, and these standards are real standards. You behave according to them. That's why you don't need a police officer.
Right. So if you have strong norms, it means that most people in the community are actually not going to try to rob and steal and do bad things to one another. But it also means that if somebody comes and does try to commit a crime, the neighbors are watching out for you because of that generalized sense of reciprocity. They're not watching your house to make sure that nobody breaks in because they know that if I watch your house tonight, you'll watch my house tomorrow. They're watching because they know that if in the future there was ever a problem, somebody else in the community is going to help them out or is going to watch out for their house. So that's a good example of how high social capital might lead to lower crime. There's a similar idea with why communities with high social capital also have healthier people. Again, there's a norm that develops that people should be healthy, right? It's also the case that when you are sick and in need, if you are alone, you have no one to help you and no one to communicate with, it can make an illness much, much worse. That when people are in communities with one another and they interact with one another, they become healthier because others are looking out for them if they fall ill. And also something seems to happen to our physical systems. We're just in better shape. Our bodies work better when we are in communities with one another. And so the literature on social capital is vast. As I mentioned, people who study crime are interested in social capital. People who study health are interested in it. People who study education, people who study economies are interested in it, because it also turns out that economies work better in places where you have high social capital. So let me ask you this question. Why do you think you have a stronger economy in places where social capital is high?
Maybe the reason is, again, in trust, because you have already mentioned these people who dealt with diamonds, and so that may be the main thing which can cause this growth and
Right,
in
because
the
if people
economy.
in a market trust one another,
Yes, and that's the main thing.
you need fewer lawyers.
Mhm.
I'm not kidding. That's really what it comes down to. You need fewer lawyers because people trust one another, and therefore you have the economic term is lower transaction costs. Every time you want to make a trade, you want to make a deal, it's a lot easier to do it because people trust one another, and they have this sense that if I try to, I'm not going to rip you off, because if I did that, then I would expect other people in the community to rip me off. But instead, if I behave well toward you, I expect others to behave well toward me. And like I said, it turns out high social capital leads to stronger economic performance. Now, I've suggested, I suppose, tonight that social capital is sort of this magic ingredient, right? It does all these wonderful things. I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is absolutely settled. There are certainly scholars who would argue that people like myself who argue that we should have greater social capital, that we perhaps do not fully appreciate all of the many other factors that might go into making a strong economy or healthy people or low crime. So I just want to flag that, make sure everybody understands that there's still a debate out about many of these things. But of course, in order to settle that debate, we have to be able to measure social capital. And so I want to actually underscore what I mean by that, because remember how this all started. Coleman is interested in all these various things, and he's trying to come up with a way to measure whether or not people trust one another. And so he settles on this idea of social networks, right? Whether or not people know each other within a community and interact with one another. And then Putnam goes to Italy, and Putnam says, well, one way that people come to know one another and interact with one another is through these clubs and groups. And so many people have just come to think, it sort of builds on your question about civil society, that if we want to measure social capital, if we want to know whether or not a place has it, we want to look at the clubs and groups and organizations that people belong to. And actually, a lot of people have done that, and there's a lot of predictive power in that. But it's not the only way we can understand social capital. In fact, there's a very important idea here, that some people measure social capital by looking at what's happening in the community. So they'll use an aggregate level measure. So they'll look at the number of people within a particular community, maybe within the city of Moscow, or within a country, or within an American state, or within an Italian region, or any other community that you might think of. They'll measure it at that level. But then others will measure it at the individual level. They want to know whether I belong to a group, or I am a trusting person, or I have a lot of social relations, as was mentioned earlier. And so there are some people who study it at the community level and some people who study it at the individual level. And the reason why that's important is methodologically that can get a little complicated, because you can actually end up with different results whether you're looking at individuals or whether you're looking at communities. And the other tricky thing about it is technically social capital as a concept refers to communities. So really that's how it should be measured. It's just often we have to look at what's going on with individuals before we can make sense of what's happening with communities. There are all sorts of other questions that come up when we're trying to study social capital. Should we worry about trust? That's in the definition of social capital. So should we simply just measure whether or not people trust other people? And there's a whole literature on that. Should we worry about whether they trust their government? There's a big debate over whether or not that's a useful measure, because in some places you might say it's perfectly reasonable to not trust your government, right? Should we only measure the groups that people belong to, as I've referred to? Should we measure the networks that people form? That is, should we actually count the number of friends that you have? And there's some people who measure it that way. And then another question is whether or not we should just take a single measure. So should we just simply track how many groups you belong to? Or should we combine a lot of different things? How many groups you belong to, how many friends you have, whether or not you attend the meetings of that group, whether or not you're trusting, whether you trust strangers, whether you trust your friends. You might want to put all of those together in an index, and you can do that and you can combine them statistically. The reason why all of this matters is if we want to understand whether or not social capital truly has a causal effect on all these things that we're interested in explaining: the performance of government, low crime, good health, strong economies. If we want to understand whether or not social capital is really causing those outcomes, we have to be able to measure it accurately. And so there's a big, as I said, sort of discussion and debate over that. But I'm actually going to set aside for a moment the question of whether or not there's a causal effect, whether social capital is actually causing these positive things. Basically because that question is ongoing. It will probably never be settled because it's one of those classic social science questions. What comes first? Is it the good democratic performance or is it the social capital? But there's another dimension, another side to social capital that I want to come back to that is also important to understand. Do you remember I said when Coleman first started writing about social capital, as he defined it, social capital was always a good thing? All right. And actually in the early literature, whether it was Coleman, whether it was Putnam, that's the way social capital was treated. It was always a good thing. It led to positive outcomes. But just think about that for a moment. Think about what social capital consists of. People associating with one another in tight-knit groups, closed networks. You might think that perhaps some negative consequences come from those sorts of groups, right? An extreme example would be hate groups. Typically have a lot of social capital. Terrorist cells have a lot of social capital. Right? And so in that big debate over whether or not social capital was up or down and did we care about it, one of the major themes was whether or not people like Putnam were too focused on social capital as always being a good thing and not recognizing that it could also be a bad thing in the sense that it leads to negative outcomes and negative consequences. And so, in the next evolution of the social capital literature, a very important distinction has come to be drawn between two different types of social capital. All right, so the two types of social capital are first bonding social capital and bridging social capital. Okay, so we've got bonding and bridging. And what do we mean by these terms? Bonding means that two similar people have a relationship with one another. So it might be two women, it might be two men, it might be two people who both have a college education, it might be two people who are of the same age. There'd be lots of different ways that we might be similar to one another. And when people come together and they share the same characteristics, that's bonding social capital. Bridging social capital is when people who are unlike one another form a relationship, are in a network together. So it might be a man and a woman, it might be a young person and an old person. It might be somebody who's religious and somebody who's not. It might be somebody who's rich and somebody who's poor. That make sense? Okay. Now, when I describe it that way, you might say, well, it's pretty obvious what's going on here. Bonding social capital is bad, right? Because these groups that form and maybe they become terrorists or they're hate groups or at least they're intolerant of others, those are all going to be people who share the same characteristics, right? That's what makes them intolerant. So bonding social capital is bad and bridging social capital is good, because when you bridge, it means you're forming friendships and networks with people who are different than yourself. Well, it turns out that the world is not that simple. It'd be nice to say, all bonding is bad and all bridging is good. But we have learned, when we have done research on this, that the world is much more complicated than that. Because all of us form bonding social capital relationships. It is human nature. The fancy word for it, is homophily. I have no idea if that translates into Russian or not, but what it means is that people who share a characteristic come together. Okay. And all of us have a natural tendency to do this. Well, like I said, it's part of human nature for people to engage in homophily. Okay. And so, in order for you to have a healthy community, you could never have a group of people who never bonded with similar people. It just would never happen. But neither could you have a community where people only bridged. You have to have a mixture of both, and that's actually quite important. And it's also not the case that some people bond and some people bridge. That's also a misunderstanding. In fact, it turns out that people who bond, people who form relationships with people who are like themselves, are also likely to bridge, to form relationships with people who are different than one another. And so it seems that if you are a person with a lot of social capital in your life, you're going to have both types of relationships. Now, if in a given community there's only bonding and no bridging, that would be unhealthy, because it would mean that people were only ever interacting. They're only having relationships with people who are like themselves and never with people who are unlike themselves. And notice that I keep using terms like yourself and unlike yourself, or characteristics, rather than focusing on any one in particular. And that's also because you can actually bond and bridge at the same time, because sometimes you'll share characteristics with people, and at the same time you'll have different characteristics in that very same person. So Galina and I, we would bond on our education level. So both of us have PhDs. But you might have noticed there's actually a very important difference between the two of us. She happens to be a woman and I happen to be a man. And so you might say that our relationship is an example of both bonding, because we share an education background, but it's also bridging because we have a different gender. Okay. So across society, you have some people bonding and some people bridging, and you need to have a balance between the two. Now, I wanted to pause and emphasize the distinction between bonding and bridging, because it's a reminder that social capital is like all forms of capital. You know, capital comes in other forms. We normally think of it as financial capital, right? The term capital usually refers to money, thus the term capitalism. Some people also write about human capital, which is knowledge, education. So you've got financial capital, you've got human capital, and you have social capital. In all three of those cases, capital can be used for things that are good and for things that are bad. We all know that financial capital can be used for bad ends, right? That's true for human capital as well. So smart people can end up doing really bad things. And that's also true for social capital. Just with social capital, we can sort of understand it, that it's not just that we've got good things over here and bad things over there. Rather, it's when the balance of those networks tend more toward the bonding and less toward the bridging, that's when we would expect to see the negative consequences to come. Which brings me to the question of how is it that people end up forming social capital? Now, remember I mentioned there are different ways to measure this, and Putnam was especially interested in group memberships. But he and I, together, we have studied one of the most common ways that social capital is built, at least in the United States, and that's through religion. And so I thought I would talk a little bit about that because, as I was saying last night in my lecture on religion in American society, you can't actually understand the United States without understanding religion. It's just a really important part of American society. And so historically, we have seen religion as one of the primary ways that Americans have come together to form these sort of networks with one another. And I just wanted to give you an example, or a few examples, of how there is this connection between religion and some of our common ways of understanding social capital as a way to overcome the collective action problem. So if you want to look here. So this chart just shows you that when we compare the United States to other countries, it has I gotta get my pointer working here. The United States has a pretty high level of religious attendance, and if you were at the lecture last night, I talked in some detail about this, and that's just to make the point that the United States is actually quite a religious country when compared to other advanced industrialized nations like Canada or Britain or Germany or France or even Russia. There's Russia right there. So this is just the percentage of people who report attending religious services in any given week. So what I'm now about to show you is the connection between how religious somebody is, again, this is in the United States, and whether or not they participate in a variety of activities that are all examples of collective action, right, that should suffer from the collective action problem. These are all things that if people were completely rational, all they worried about was themselves, they should never do them. So what I'm going to show you is a series of figures. They're all basically the same pattern, where people in the United States are ranked from whether they are highly secular, that is, they have a low level of religiosity, or whether they have a high level of religiosity. These are based on statistical models that are also controlling for a variety of other characteristics of people that might explain why they do these various things. Okay? So we're isolating the impact of religiosity. And what do we see? Well, the more religious you are, the more likely you are to belong to civic groups. And remember, that's one of our key measures of social capital. Okay, so the more religious you are, the more likely you are to belong to civic groups. You're also more likely to be an officer or a committee member, that is somebody who's a leader of one of those groups. You're also more likely to have attended a public meeting. This is one of the ways that governments end up working better, because more people attend meetings and express to their elected officials what they want done. You're also more likely to belong specifically to a group that is working to reform society or is a political group. You're also more likely to say you've worked to solve a community problem. So the question asks whether or not you've gotten together with your neighbors to solve some problem that you see in your community. And, just to bring us back to where I started, you're also more likely to say that you voted in local elections. And remember, that was our classic case of the collective action problem. If everybody only worried about themselves, they'd never turn out to vote. And yet, people who are more religious are more likely to turn out to vote. Now, the reason why religion is so interesting is that historically, religion has led to a lot of bonding social capital. That should make sense, because when you get together with people of the same religion, by definition, you're bonding. You come together with people who believe the same things that you do. And because of that high level of bonding social capital formed through religion and very little bridging, historically, in the United States, but I'd suggest in lots of other places too, there have been a lot of tensions between religious groups. So minority religions, groups such as Jews and Catholics, who actually have long been a minority faith in America, or a group like the Mormons, have suffered discrimination and even violence. But here's what's interesting. As I discussed in my lecture on religion last night, today Americans are increasingly tolerant of people with other religions. Now, some tensions still remain, maybe especially with Muslims and a few other groups as well. But for the most part, Americans are actually increasingly tolerant toward people of different religions. And why is that? Well, the reason is that Americans have increasingly formed bridges across religious lines. They've formed bridging social capital between those who have different faiths. Now, up to now, I have focused on social networks as a way of understanding social capital. But don't forget that when Coleman was first working on this concept, he was also interested in norms. Right? It's the networks that lead to social norms. A norm like you ought to turn out to vote, or you ought to donate blood, or you ought to volunteer for charity. And I just thought I would briefly end on a note about some of my other research. I not only study religion, but I'm also interested in schools and what happens when young people attend school, and how do they learn about civics and political life, and whether or not to be involved in their political system. And what I've found, perhaps not surprisingly, is that schools are an especially powerful institution to teach people norms. So norms are certainly taught and absorbed through all these groups and associations I've been talking about. But a school is an especially prime place for young people to learn what the norms are for their behavior. Now, we all know that, right? This is what happens when you go to school. You learn that you're supposed to do your homework and that you're supposed to sit still and listen to the teacher. But you also learn how to be a member of a community. You learn how to contribute for the betterment of others. And you also, hopefully, learn that to be an active citizen means that you need to worry about more than just yourself, but you need to worry about your community as well. And that includes turning out to vote. You can tell that I'm particularly interested in that question, because I do happen to think that it's important that people vote. and that they cast an informed vote. And so in my other research, I have found that if young people, so teenagers, if they attend a high school where there is a strong norm that encourages them to vote, and this varies a lot, at least in the United States. In some schools, that's a very common idea. In other schools, it's not so common. But if you happen to be a young person who attends a school where those around you believe that it is important to turn out to vote, so in other words, there's a norm coming out of the social networks that are formed within that school, and that norm encourages people to vote. Young people who attend those schools are indeed more likely to vote when they become adults. In fact, we can predict whether or not they're going to be a voter all the way back when they're in high school. So I can sort of look forward and see what happens up to 15 years later in their life. And not only are they more likely to vote, but they're also more likely to serve as a volunteer in their community. In other words, they've come to overcome the collective action problem, not just when it comes to voting, but in these other forms of behavior that contribute to a better community. So let me just wrap this up by bringing us back to the beginning. I started by asking you why it is that people would vote, or why people would do all these other things that are all examples of behavior that we wouldn't expect individuals to do if all they cared about was benefiting themselves. And I suggested that one reason for that is that people learn a norm, that they ought to behave a certain way. And those norms, in turn, come out of the social networks that we form with one another. And all of that constitutes social capital. But then I also reminded you that social capital can come in two different flavors: bonding and bridging. And that any healthy society, any healthy community, needs to have a mixture of both bonding and bridging. If there's too much bonding, then we would expect intolerance. And we could never have a society that was only based on bridging because of homophily. People like to form relationships with people who are like themselves. So this gives us all a challenge, not only as scholars to explain social capital, to understand it, but I would also suggest that it falls on us as citizens and as members of a community to take seriously the need for all of us to build social capital, to not only bond with people who are like ourselves, but to form bridges with people who are unlike ourselves. And I will close with that. So thank you very much for your attention tonight. Are there any other questions or anything else that people want to cover?
I have a question about the modern and maybe not so modern situation. This trend that religious people are more willing to vote, to participate in different community problems, maybe. Do we see in history the same thing? Maybe in the middle of the 20th century, at the beginning.
That's a good question. No, we don't, actually, because it really depends on the way that religions are organized. In fact, one of the great ironies of Putnam's work is that if you go back and read what he found in Italy, in places where the Catholic Church was stronger, Italy is a Catholic country, but in places where the Church was stronger rather than weaker, are actually places where there was less social capital, not more social capital. And the reason for that is in Italy, historically, the Catholic Church has been organized very hierarchically. So in that tight hierarchy, you haven't found much of the sort of interaction that you would in a more, sometimes the term is horizontal, or a more layperson-oriented congregation. So in places where you don't have much interaction among churchgoers, then you wouldn't expect to see much social capital. So it depends on how the religion is organized. And so historically, actually, you wouldn't necessarily expect to find religions organized in a horizontal way, because I think most were organized in a hierarchical way, in a vertical.
Even in the USA, yeah?
Well, yes, although you mentioned the Middle Ages, right?
Maybe the 19th century.
In the 19th century.
Of the 20th century.
I would say by the time we get to the 19th and certainly the 20th century, both in the U.S. but also in many other places as well, religions were more likely to bring people together in a more horizontal, less hierarchical way. But if you go again way back centuries, I wouldn't necessarily expect that.
I would, I wonder, you have here the correlation between the last chapter, the correlation between local elections and religious community. Have you looked through the correlation between religious and general community? I mean, national elections.
Yes, and you do actually, you find the same basic trend. The reason we focus on the local elections, and this is kind of a technical point, is we don't get as much variation on turnout in national elections. And the reason for that is when you ask people, did you turn out to vote? You get a lot more people telling you they voted than actually voted. Right? So social desirability is a problem. And so because many people are reporting that they voted when they didn't actually, all of those bars are much higher. And since they're all higher and they can't go higher than 100%, it's harder in order to, to detect a trend. So that's why we use this question that asks, it's a pretty strict standard. Do you vote in all local elections? Or then we combine those who say they vote in most local elections. And if you sort of think about that, if you're responding to that survey and you want the person who's asking you the question to still think you're a good person, you can admit, okay, maybe I don't vote in every local election, but I vote in most of them, or I vote in some of them. That's easier for people to say than, no, I didn't vote in the presidential election, because they know they were supposed to have voted. That's this whole idea of there being a norm that encourages voting. So anyway, bottom line is, yes, religious people are more likely to turn out in presidential elections, but the relationship is not quite as strong as I've shown you here with the local.
And the second, if everybody is, I would like to know the technical aspect of this research. So I understand that you have the survey, yes, but what is the representative sampling?
Sure.
And the second point is, what other methods do you use except survey?
Okay. So the survey itself, this particular one that I'm referring to, but what I'm about to say applies to many other surveys that I have been a part of and that I use. They're all based on a probability sample of the American population, which means that in theory, every citizen, or actually every resident, it doesn't matter whether they're a citizen or not, every resident of the United States has an equal probability of being chosen for our survey. And the reason we can say that with some confidence is that this particular survey was done by telephone. And you can randomly generate telephone numbers. So even if people haven't listed their phone number, we can still call them and administer the survey. Now that's how it works ideally and in theory. In practice, it's not quite that clean because not everybody agrees to do the survey. So one of the ways that we encourage people to participate in the survey is we pay them. So you could make up to, I think, $50. Maybe we paid some people $75 to do our survey. So you could actually make money doing that. But even then, we still don't get everyone responding. In fact, low response rates are a real problem for those of us who do surveys. But what we do know is when we look at our respondents to our survey, we know whether or not they reflect the right demographic characteristics of the overall population. And this sample is actually quite good. We do pretty well in matching what people should look like. The overall sample size, if you're interested, is about 3,100 people. And as surveys go, that's actually pretty big. I've been involved in some that are bigger, and I've been involved in some that are smaller. And there are trade-offs. Of course, it's more expensive to do a bigger survey, and you generally can't ask as many questions. But Is that responsive, or is there more you want to know about the survey?
Yeah, no, the survey.
That's okay. You also asked about other methods that I use. In addition to survey research, which is actually the main thing that I rely on, I have also done qualitative research. So in the book that Putnam and I published together, we have a number of case studies of different religious groups in the United States that are almost like ethnographies. So we actually had research assistants go and spend a lot of time with these people and learn all about them. And so we report that without using any statistics or numbers. It's just, telling their story. In other research that I've done, I've also used experiments. So a survey just asks people their opinion or asks them to tell you about their behavior. But in an experiment, we're changing something. Where maybe if it's done on a computer, we're having them read a news story, for example. And in one news story, we give them one piece of information, and then in another story, we give them another piece of information, and we randomly assign people to read one story versus the other, and we compare their reactions. And you can learn a lot about political views by doing that sort of thing. So that's primarily what I do. You wanted me to say that I study history, but
No. I'm not interested in history in that case. I'm interested mostly. No, of course I'm a historian, but the problem is that now I'm studying contemporary history, which is not history at all. That's why I'm interested in all this stuff. Yes, surveys, statistics,
Yeah.
and so on.
And increasingly, what we've done in the U.S., although I'm sure this has been the case in Russia as well. I mentioned that this survey, where these results come from, was done over the telephone. The telephone has become an extremely difficult way to do surveys, just because people do not want to do surveys over the phone. They won't answer the phone, or if you do get them, they just won't do it. So increasingly, researchers like myself have turned to online surveys, computer surveys. And there are lots of advantages to doing surveys over the internet. There are disadvantages. It's a lot harder to get a representative sample of the population. It's possible, but it's much more difficult to do that. It'd be almost impossible because not everyone's online.
Computer users and
Yeah,
internet
it's
users
an
is
issue.
enough.
But that used to be the case with telephones. There was once a time when not everybody had a telephone. And so when we switched to telephone surveys, there was this question of, well, how could we really say we have a representative sample because not everybody has a phone?
I just remember a statistic which I saw several probably months ago about the number of people who are using internet so in different regions, and it was really very low in some of them.
In some places, it's as low as 20%.
So the article was about the decline of social capital. What's today? It was 20 years ago. What's the situation today in the USA?
Well, for the most part, those declines have either continued or they have begun to flatten out. I wouldn't say that they've necessarily increased, with one exception. I'll tell you about that in a moment. But in general, the lines have continued to decline. And one of the most powerful indicators of that is actually not the groups and organizations that people belong to, but a series of questions that have been asked on surveys about people's friendships, which is also a part of social capital. And it turns out that at least Americans, I can't speak to people in other countries, but at least Americans today have fewer friends than they used to, which is almost amazing, right? Because we have Facebook and Twitter and all this stuff. But yeah, but it turns out that there are fewer friendship relationships among people, and that's an important indicator. The one exception, though, or an exception, is among American young people. We've actually seen an increase in the last few years in volunteering, volunteering in your community and such. So there's some evidence that maybe it doesn't always have to be declining, that it's possible for this stuff to change and come back up. which has happened in the past, and maybe that's what's happening now with young people, at least with volunteering.
Volunteering, I think we have the same situation today in our country.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's come up? Yeah.
Last 5 years.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And don't you think that we should estimate these criteria in a different way? I mean, so should we maybe change these criteria because today we live in a kind of different society, and you also have mentioned well, social nets as Facebook and
Right.
something like that, and maybe we need to estimate the meaning of friendship. So, and maybe these connections now have a bit different levels. So that is why we have a decrease. Well, in all of those well graphs you well represented here. So maybe the this is the main idea of this
Right.
kind of change.
Well, what you've identified is exactly the debate that was taking place in the mid-1990s about social capital. Remember I said that, Putnam, he tracks over time people who belong to these various groups and associations, and he finds a decline, and many of his critics said, well, perhaps that's true, but we're not capturing these new ways that people associate with one another. And that was pre-Facebook. That was right when the internet was just starting, or it was something that regular civilian people were using. Prior to that, it was really just scientists in the military who were using the internet. And what we found since is that while people do form these relationships online and through other forms as well, but maybe primarily online, it doesn't appear as though those relationships that you might have with somebody through Facebook or through other electronic means, those relationships do not seem to have the same sort of effect that a face-to-face interaction does. So maybe it's a new form of social capital, but if it is, it's a weaker form of social capital than the sort of networks the social networks we talked about before we had Facebook or before we had the internet.
Well, the same trend happens with the education. So we have new theory of connectivism, and this theory was represented by one of the Canadians, Jones, if I'm not mistaken, and where in this theory he tells that maybe it is not really bad just to have a kind of even online education, not so why not to use these connections on Facebook or other social nets to construct a kind of different, society.
Right. Well, this is where I would leave it. It is certainly conceivable to me that a new and different kind of form of social capital could be developed online, and perhaps, or through other ways, and perhaps eventually people will figure out how to overcome collective action problems through those kinds of social networks. But we're not quite there yet. And one of the reasons is, remember that a core idea behind social capital is that people come to trust one another. And it's actually very difficult to form trust online for perhaps obvious reasons. You're never quite sure who you're talking to. You're never quite sure whether they are representing themselves accurately. There's a famous cartoon. I don't know. Have you ever seen this cartoon? It goes back a long ways of a dog sitting in front of a computer, and he turns to another dog and he says, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." Are there other questions? We've exhausted it. We've bonded. We've bridged. So go out, form social capital, transform society, and all will be well. thank you for your attention. I know this is a long stretch, but I appreciate your questions and the interaction. And